My guest today is Stephen Gunn, and today we are going to discuss British military during the 1600s and the height of the British Empire. And I want to ask, how did you come across studying exactly this era and the military history of it?
I studied a lot of 16th century history, first of all at school. A lot of British people study 16th century history at school. I've been writing for most of my career about the political and the social history of 16th century England, but I've always been quite interested in warfare as part of that. And I suppose I've had broader interests in military history probably since I was a small boy, reading C.S. Forester's novels about Horatio Hornblower and making model airplanes and the kind of things small boys used to do in the 1960s and 70s. So this is putting the two together, I suppose, a broader interest in military history and an interest in the political and the social and the cultural history of 16th century England.
So how do you go on about studying, before we get started, how do you go on about studying in British military history, especially in this era?
The documents that you have to use are quite numerous, but they're quite widely scattered. There's always a temptation, I think, for historians, because the English state was quite strongly established quite early in its history and it generated a lot of records. There's a temptation to try and write all the history you can from the records of central government. But actually, what I've realized, and I think what many people would argue, is that you can't really understand government and society without also looking at lots of local records. So you need to go around lots and lots of different archives in different parts of England and even indeed in other countries in order to get enough different perspectives on what was happening in these wars in order to understand them from the point of view of the population at the time, rather than just understanding them from the point of view of the king and the ministers around the king who were trying to organize the wars.
Now, with Roman sources, it's quite the danger that they might be incredibly biased. Is that fair here as well, that the sources might not be accurate, that they may be biased?
Well, it's certainly the case that the chroniclers writing at the time, I suppose, understandably wanted to write about things that had gone right for the English army and not so much about things that had gone wrong for the English army. On the other hand, even amongst the chroniclers, there's quite a diversity, because you have people writing predominantly in towns who are just interested in what's happening in their town and the news that's coming into their town about what's happening in wars in other countries. You have people trying to write a national history that glorifies kings and looks back to the great military successes of the English in the past, particularly in the Hundred Years' War in the 14th and 15th centuries. But then you also have people there's a marvelous man called Ellis Griffith, who is a Welsh soldier fighting in mostly in the English garrison in Calais in northern France. And he just writes, it's meant to be a history of the world, but a lot of it is just about his life. And he keeps telling you about who his friends were in the army and what they thought of the officers commanding them and why the officers weren't any good and why the plans they were trying to follow were stupid plans and so on. So that gives you more of a view from the lower ranks of what it was like fighting in these armies.
That kind of thought interesting as well, finding out what was not just what it was like for the rich and the higher level, but also the common folks and the common soldier, right?
Exactly. Although the interesting thing about him is that he regards himself as a professional. He knows what he's doing. He's a career soldier, and so he is a bit disdainful of some of the officers. But in a way, he's even more disdainful of the recruits who are just pulled into the army for one season of fighting. And his view is basically they just want to go home again, and they keep complaining that they're not having a nice, quiet sleep at home with their wife, and they can't be bothered to be proper soldiers in the way that he regards himself and his friends as being proper soldiers. So you get a sense of the different kinds of attitudes inside the army as well.
And before we begin diving into the British military, I want to talk about, you mentioned it a little bit, but the state of the British military, if you could elaborate on what the state of the military was in the 16th century.
One of the distinctive things about the English army in the 16th century is that it's very small. At least the permanent part of it is very small compared with the armies of powerful continental states. So France, or the Spanish kingdoms, or even the Netherlands, they would have quite large permanent standing bodies of troops being paid all the time, paid out of regular tax revenues. The English state didn't have regular tax revenues, at least regular direct tax revenues like that. It had regular indirect taxation, taxation on trade, which meant that it didn't have the money to have a large permanent army. And so it's one of the distinctive things about the development of English military resources in the 16th century, that they have an increasingly large and increasingly permanent navy, but they have a fairly small permanent army, hundreds of men at a time when the population of the country is 2 or 3 million. So the army has a very small professional corps, and then when the kings want to raise an army, they then call on noblemen to bring the tenants from their estates. They call on towns to send drafts of men from their towns, and so you get a sudden, very large recruitment. And it's something that contemporaries, even on the continent, comment on, that the kings of England don't have a big army, but then when they call all their subjects to go and fight, they can get lots of men to go and fight. So obviously that's advantageous to the king from the point of view of the fact that he hasn't got to try to find the money to pay for a permanent army all the time. It's disadvantageous because his soldiers don't have the experience and they don't necessarily have the quality of equipment and so on that people serving more constantly in continental armies would have.
And you mentioned, I want to go deeper into it. How would you join the military? Is it like in this country, Norway, you have 1 year of mandatory service? Was it the same back then, or how many years of service was there in the British Army, and how did you join the military?
There's no fixed length for how long you serve for. So there's a distinction between people who are permanent and professional, if you like, who would be in the army for 5, 10, maybe 15 or 20 years. Someone like Ellis Griffith has a long career serving in these permanent garrisons. And those permanent garrisons, that to begin with, they're only really at Calais, the last part of France held by the English, and at Berwick, which is the big border town against Scotland in the north. As the 16th century goes on, then the English garrisons in Ireland start to become larger and larger. So that becomes the core of the permanent military establishment from the middle of the 16th century onwards. But we're still only talking about a few thousand men. We're not talking about large armies on a continental scale. Other people would serve for 1 year or 2 years, as long as the war went on. They might well never serve again. So some people would have been recruited by their landlord, particularly say if they're a household servant of a leading military nobleman, they would go and fight with that military nobleman every time he goes off, sent off to command an army by the king. Some people sent out by towns if they quite enjoyed spending a summer in the army, would be prepared to go more than once probably, but a lot of people seem to have gone once, and if they came home they thought, right, that's my bit of military service done, and it'll be somebody else's turn next time. And there is a shift over the course of the 16th century from a situation where quite a lot of fit adult men seem to have thought, well, it was their duty to go and fight at some point. And certainly the government's view is that all men between 16 and 60 are liable for military service, although some of them are too ill or too old to serve, but that they, in theory at least, all men between 16 and 60 should be able to go and fight. In practice, as the 16th century goes on, you see local authorities, both in the countryside and in towns, tending not to send people who are socially respectable and wealthy, but rather looking for people who they think are local troublemakers or poor people who aren't really contributing much to the local economy and so on, or indeed they're drafting people from prisons. So there is a drift downwards in the social standing of the people being recruited as ordinary soldiers into the army, whereas aristocrats, noblemen, seem to have thought all the way through that it was their duty to go and fight, and that they should emulate their great ancestors in the past who had won these great victories against the French in the 14th and 15th centuries.
Now, if you were poor and the king wanted a peasant, and the king wanted to gather a large army, like you mentioned before, did you have a choice back then, or did you say, I don't really want to? Can we do this another time? Maybe was that even a choice, or did you have to go?
Well, I think the social pressures to go were pretty strong. So
But you're a coward if you didn't want to go, and if you stayed at home.
Well, maybe you're a coward. Desertion rates they're not enormous, but they're significant. So certainly troops disappear between the point of being recruited in their village in England and getting to the port on the coast from which they're going to leave to go and fight on the continent. Once they're in France, it's harder for them to desert, but they quite often mutiny. So English troops will behave rather in the ways that peasants will in a peasant rebellion, where they say, we're not trying to overthrow the whole army. We're just putting our demands in the way that other 16th century armies do. The Spanish army in the later 16th century is famous for having very organized mutinies. So desertion and mutiny seem to be fairly common tactics for soldiers who just don't like the situation that they find themselves in. Whether you could say
how often would a mutiny be successful, and what happened if it wasn't successful?
Well, it's very likely to be successful, because if enough of the army mutinies, then the commanders can't really do anything.
Yeah.
They haven't got anybody to tell. So sometimes you have situations where part of the army will mutiny, or at least will dispute orders, and another part will argue against it. Ellis Griffith tells us a great story of a large group of soldiers chanting home, 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 because they want to give up on the campaign that they're on and just go home. And another group of soldiers who have volunteered just to try to make money out of plunder because they don't really have a job back in England. They're all chanting hang, 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 meaning that you people are betraying the army and you ought to be executed for it. So it's a bit like two football crowds chanting at each other or something. So you have that kind of dispute inside the army. But obviously, if you're the commanders as well, if you've got a lot of troops who are just refusing to go where you want them to go, and you're all in the middle of hostile territory, you probably have to negotiate a way out of it quite quickly, which may well involve agreeing, at least in part, to what the soldiers want to do.
Was it difficult for a commander to get respect of the army, or what? How did you get respect from the army?
I think it probably varies, and it's interesting. Ellis Griffith again comments on how different it is. He says there are some noblemen who just shout at people and hit them and behave tyrannically towards them when they're trying to make them do things. But there are others who treat the troops under their leadership well and try to persuade them and try to encourage them to do things well. And he obviously thinks the officers who encourage people are much better than the ones who just shout at people and try to hit them to make them do what they're supposed to do. So clearly there are different styles of leadership, if you like, and some work better than others. And of course, you've got various incentives you can try to apply. So clearly, if they do manage to capture towns, for example, in France, then they'll plunder the towns, and so then the troops are very excited about that. And Ellis Griffith, again, he always plays this part of how he's the old veteran who just understands things. And he says, "Oh well, the trouble with the English was they were so used to drinking beer that they'd never really seen wine before. So when we captured this town in France, they just all went for the wine, and they were all helpless because they'd never really drunk wine." So plunder is certainly an issue, but on the other hand, there is potentially very fierce punishment for desertion. You can be executed for deserting, but of course, if enough of you mutiny, then you can't all be executed. So that's where you
wouldn't have an army left.
Is difficult. Sorry,
you wouldn't have an army left if you executed everyone.
Well, exactly.
And do we have any idea of what a basic camp would look, military camp would look like? I mean, I want to compare to the Roman army again. There we know they had like a fortress and they had barracks. We know quite a lot about what a Roman camp would look like, but do we have any idea of what a British military camp would look like in this time?
We certainly have ideas in that we've got paintings that are done not long after some of these campaigns. Sadly, the best ones don't survive because they were wall paintings on a house which subsequently burnt down, but there are 18th century engravings taken from those wall paintings. And so they suggest that there would be tents, the majority of soldiers probably sleeping in tents, at least until things got really out of hand. Again, Ellis Griffith says, well, the trouble with these raw recruits was they didn't understand how to build themselves a shelter if they hadn't got a tent. But clearly most of them had got tents. They do have problems with transport. They're always trying to hire more carts and wagons to carry all their stuff with them. So they don't seem to be armies that move very lightly and rapidly really across the countryside. They're trying to carry quite a lot of stuff, not only the very heavy guns, which inevitably move very slowly, but also tents and things like that. Whether they fortify their camps is a bit harder to say. Most of the images we've got are of sieges rather than of armies on the move across the countryside. And obviously in sieges, everything's a bit more permanent because they're trying to dig themselves earth retrenchments to put the siege artillery in. They're trying to build trenches so that they can get nearer to the walls of the place that they're besieging. And so those do look more organized and potentially a bit more fortified. I'm not sure about English commanders, but certainly commanders of this period on the continent. They're very interested in Roman fortification, and they'll read books about how the Romans fortified their camps. So that Roman model is out there, and people are thinking about it at the time.
And I did not want to draw a comparison to the Roman army. And was, like you said, the fortifications, was there a lot of permanent camp, or was it like you said, they would rarely pack up because they had a lot of stuff to carry, but was there, how often would the camp be permanent, set down? Like a year or two maybe, or longer?
No, I mean, there aren't permanent camps because there isn't a permanent army. So this is a period before barracks, really. And so the closest you would come would be garrison towns like Calais or Berwick, or some of the new garrison forts being built in Ireland, Fort Protector and places like that. These are places, but even there, where the soldiers mostly probably were just billeted on the ordinary people in the town. So there isn't a sort of barracks life in quite the same way that there is in armies from the later 17th century onwards.
And let's say I'm a peasant from a small town who had to been called in back and my community to go fight for the army in a war. What would be the chance? What would the training be like? Would I have training at all? Was it like, here's a gun, don't point it at the enemy, just pull the trigger? Was it that kind of?
It would depend what weapon you were using. The English government in the 14th and 15th centuries and on into the 16th century is very obsessed with training people in archery. And there are various different reasons for that. One is that they're convinced that they won the great battles in the 100 Years' War, Crécy and Poitiers and Agincourt, because of the ability of English archers. And to some extent, that's true. There's also a problem, though, that the making of armor had improved particularly since the 14th century, but even since the 15th century, so that English archery was less effective than it had been in the 14th and 15th centuries. So there's a historical mythology around archery, which means that the government is very concerned to tell people that they must keep practicing archery. In theory, every adult man is meant to practice archery every Sunday afternoon after church, and you can see local communities building archery practice targets and keeping up areas of the village or town where people are supposed to go and do this practice. And indeed, some towns will even fine people for not going and doing their archery practice, or not owning a bow and arrow, so they can't go and do it. So the other reason for that seems to be that the pull weight of the bows that they're using is extremely heavy, much heavier than a modern Olympic bow or other kinds of competition bow, and therefore they do need to practice regularly from a young age in order to be able to pull these very heavy bows, because you need the power of the bow in order to stand a chance of putting an arrow through any kind of protection, whether steel plate armor or leather protection or whatever. So that's another reason. And in fact, people looking, for example, at skeletons from the Mary Rose, the shipwreck that was raised from off the English coast, or looking at the burial pits from the Battle of Towton, a battle in the civil wars in England in the 15th century, they can show that there are deformities of the shoulders and hip and elbow in some of the skeletons, which suggest that people have been doing this archery practice with very, very heavy bows. So if you're an archer, you should have been practicing already, and you won't need any more training. If your archers work in combination with people either with pikes, 16-foot, 18-foot long pikes, they're the newer weapon, or the older English weapon that would go with bows would be bills, which are really like large, strong agricultural pruning hooks. So they would be a lot shorter than a pike, but would have quite a complicated blade on the end. So if you're using one of those, probably that's easier because it's more like using an agricultural tool that you might be used to. On the other hand, you might be expected to wear more armor than you'd be used to. And again, there are signs that, for example, towns have what they call marching watches, where the men from the trade guilds dress up every year and march through the town in armor. And part of the point of that is just to get people used to putting armor on and walking in armor, because otherwise it's something that they're not used to. Firearms are a different problem, because firearms are spreading through the English population in the 16th century, but spreading through.
I wanted to ask about what is common with firearms at this point.
They're getting more common, but they're pretty rare. I've just been writing a conference paper on accidents with firearms in the 16th century, and we've got this big sample of accidental death reports from the 16th century, and there are no accidental deaths with firearms recorded in the first 10 years of the century, and then they rise slowly from being fewer than 1 in 100 accidental deaths up to being about 1 in 50 accidental deaths being with firearms by the 1580s and 1590s.
So it was basically like with cars and seatbelts back in the old days then.
Yeah, exactly. That as they spread, people get more used to them. But also, and I suppose it's a bit different from cars, the technology is changing quite dramatically over the 16th century. So to begin with, the big problem, because they are matchlocks, so they're lit. You light the gun to discharge it with a lit match of string. So the big problem there is you mustn't get any other flame near the gun. So if you put it down too near a candle, it will catch fire and go off. That's improved on from the mid-16th century by various firing mechanisms using flints, what are called wheel locks or snap hances. So they're much safer. You can put them down near a candle as long as you're not too near a candle. On the other hand, they're quite delicate mechanisms. So if you put them down too hard, then the mechanism will go off and you'll shoot yourself. So we've got one man who goes into an inn I think it's in Cirencester in Gloucestershire, and just puts his gun down on the table and shoots himself in the stomach because he's put the gun down slightly too hard, and the vibration just sets off the gun. We've got somebody else who puts a gun on a table and a dog jumps onto the table and sets off the gun. So the technology's changing, but each change in the technology provides a different set of problems with keeping yourself safe around these firearms. So those people do need training with, and there are signs that towns in particular, because guns seem to spread first in towns and then later in the countryside, people in towns are trying to take some of their more able young men and train them to use guns in the way that they're meant to have been training them to use bows and arrows before that point.
Now you mentioned bow and arrows, and I want to ask: was crossbow a common use as well, or was it more bows?
Crossbows are pretty rare. They're used for. They're not really. Well, the English don't really use them in war very much at all in the 16th century. They're used for things like hunting birds, but the English, and in part it is this historical mythology. I think the English just think their longbows are better than any other bow, and therefore all proper Englishmen should shoot a proper English longbow. So you are, for example, by legislation, you're not really supposed to own a crossbow. Every man is supposed to own a longbow instead. You are allowed to have a crossbow to defend your home because it's.
Oh, they can't take my crossbow away.
And then they changed the legislation to say you can have a crossbow, or in fact, you can have a gun to defend your home.
The government want to take my crossbow away. I'm not going to let them.
Exactly. So it's the same. It's the same idea. And some of these accidents with guns, actually, you have guns which are kept loaded in the house, and they say it's to defend the house in case burglars come. But then, of course, somebody puts down a candle too near to them, and then they fire off.
So we talked about the military training, but what was there discipline in the army as well?
There is. It's a bit hard to know exactly who's exercising the discipline because the internal structures of the army are not always very clear. So whether there seem to be the equivalent of non-commissioned officers in modern armies, but exactly how that very small group leadership and command works is one of the things that it's very hard to work out. At the larger scale, there is discipline in the sense that there are ordinances of war issued, so they're printed sets of orders for how the army is to behave, and they're read out by the captains to the troops. How far those things are actually obeyed is harder to know, really. And there's some exemplary punishment, so armies will execute people who have plundered churches, for example. But again, how much of that is going on without being punished is very difficult to tell.
I want to talk about, because as you know, the empire was quite large at this point in time. It had colonies all over the world. And what was the chances if you were, like you said, there wasn't really any career soldiers, but was there any chance that you could be sent to, like, maybe Canada or an Indian or African colony when you said it?
That's a later development, really. So the English, their first successful colonies in North America don't happen until the 17th century, and they start in the 17th century to have a few garrisons on the coasts of India, but the major expansion in India is not really till the 18th century. So the period that we're looking at, the place where this would happen mostly is in Ireland, because in Ireland you've had a partially complete conquest from England several hundred years before this. So you have areas nearer England and Wales that are mostly settled with people of English or Anglo-Norman origin, and then you have areas beyond their control which are still inhabited by the original Gaelic inhabitants of Ireland, who still speak Gaelic, are led by their own chiefs, and are raiding each other for cattle and other economic resources, but also raiding the English and Anglo-Norman settlers along the east coast. So the English government increasingly gets involved in setting up garrisons and providing troops to try to defend the English settled areas of Ireland against the Gaelic areas, and slowly but surely expand the areas of English control. So if you're looking for a long-term military career, but often under what look to English people pretty unpleasant circumstances, very wet, not very good food supplies, enemies who don't necessarily fight in quite the way you're expecting because they don't fight like continental armies, then Ireland is where you'll be facing those things as an English soldier.
What was the behavior of the soldier if you were sent to the elaborate on this? What was the behavior of the soldier in the colony of Ireland?
Well, as you can imagine,
I also towards civilians and
yeah,
in
well,
general.
there are complaints about it, as you can imagine. One of the great paradoxes, really, of the English situation in Ireland is that the English keep telling themselves and keep telling the Irish that they're the more civilized people, and they're bringing civilization and enlightenment and the rule of law and so on to these Gaelic societies, which they claim don't have it, although what they have is a different kind of civilization and the rule of a different kind of law. But in order to impose English power, then some, at least, of the captains in Elizabethan Ireland start behaving in extremely lawless ways. So they will just take hostages and behead them, and then order other people to come and see them, allegedly marching up between a line of these severed heads, in order to impress that that's the kind of brutal thing they'll do if you don't cooperate with them. So English soldiers, in dealing with the Gaelic Irish, are extremely brutal at times, and indeed, when the big war between the Gaelic Irish and the English at the end of Elizabeth's reign is only finished by the English when they start to adopt scorched earth tactics, cause starvation amongst the population, and so on. So there are horrible atrocities done by the English against the Irish in those circumstances, but simultaneously the English and Irish inhabitants of the English settled areas in the east of Ireland are also complaining about the behaviour of the troops, because they say the kinds of things that troops, that populations with troops billeted on them say all over Europe, that troops won't pay for their food properly, and they won't pay for their drink properly, and they keep demanding the best seat next to the fire when they're billeted on you, and so on. So the English soldiers don't necessarily get on very well either with the people on whom they're billeted, whom they're meant to be defending, or the people out beyond the border against whom they're meant to be making war.
And how would I want to know? You just talked a little bit about this in the beginning, but I want to know more, elaborate again more on the British Navy and the state of the Navy. You mentioned that was more of the permanent side of the British Army. What was the Navy like?
Yes, well, the Navy is expanding quite dramatically across the 16th century. One of the reasons why it's more permanent, I think, is that, as is true of navies across 16th century Europe, in a sense, they have to be more permanent than armies, because if you have a cannon, you can just leave it in a castle for a number of years, and it might need new wooden wheels and so on, but basically you can get it out and use it again. If you've got a ship, you can't just leave it in the sea for a few years, because it will have rotted by the time you come back and try and use it again. So ships need dockyards, they need constant upkeep, and also, if they're going to sail anywhere, they need carefully organized supplies of food, supplies of drinking water, or drinking beer, probably in most cases, and so on. So navies take a lot of organizing, but also navies are harder just to call into being when you need them than armies are. So the English at least think that you can take people who are working on a farm all year and say, you've been doing your archery practice, haven't you? You're in the army for the next few months, and that seems to work all right. They do try taking trading ships and just putting some guns on them, but increasingly those kinds of ships are not able to compete with ships built deliberately for large-scale gunnery. And one of the key technical innovations there is the invention of the gun port, which enables you to have cannon lower down on a ship and fire them, so you can have heavier cannon without unbalancing the ship by firing the cannon. And there are experiments in ship design. So Henry VIII builds a lot of ships in the first half of the 16th century. Many of them are rather large and high in the water and unwieldy, have a lot of guns on. The Mary Rose famously sinks, possibly because it's trying to turn too fast, and a lot of water comes in through the gun ports while it's trying to turn and fight at the same time. The Elizabethan Navy, partly based on the experience of English shipping trading more widely around the world, sailing into the Mediterranean, sailing to West Africa, sailing to attack or at least trade without permission with the Spanish colonies in South and Central America. They then changed their ship designs to what are called race-built galleons, which are longer and lower, very maneuverable, still very heavily gunned, but much more reliable and effective than the ships of Henry VIII's navy. So the Elizabethan navy seems to have good technical capabilities, as well as being quite well organized, and that is put to the test because it's the main means to defend England against attack from Spain, which is the greatest kingdom in Western Europe at the time, in the Spanish Armada in 1588.
Now, a few episodes ago, we talked about piracy and pirates, and that they were starting to build up in the late 1600s and 1700s, that we started to become a big problem, that they were labeled terrorists. But was there piracy problems for the British Navy at this point in time too, in late 1600s maybe, or in the 1600s?
Yes, there is. There's always a slightly blurred line between piracy and privateering, because privateering is where your government, or a government that you can get to do it, has given you permission to go and attack foreign shipping as part of a war, and piracy is where you're just attacking any ship you can find on your own account. But of course, peace suddenly being made between two powers doesn't necessarily get through very quickly to the people who are sailing around attacking shipping. So you might find that
there were no internet back then.
Exactly, no internet. So you might well have left port as a privateer and actually come back to be told you're now a pirate. There's certainly also signs that in Elizabeth's reign, there are officials in charge of different ports in England and Wales who are really turning a blind eye to piracy. So these seem to be people who are very happy to take a cut of the profits of people who sail out of their port, capture shipping without really bothering too much whether they're enemy ships or not, and then come back and sell things. So there is a piracy problem, but there's also, particularly in the Elizabethan War against Spain, a really major privateering industry. When war breaks out between England and Spain, English imports, for example, of sugar, which is brought in by the Spanish and Portuguese from their colonies and trading posts around the world, English imports of sugar drop, but then sufficient sugar is captured from Spanish and Portuguese ships to make up for the sugar that isn't being legally imported anymore. So that Elizabethan privateering enterprise is large scale and pretty successful, and some of it indeed generates the capital that then goes into founding the East India Company, which becomes the big English trading company to the Far East in the 17th and 18th centuries, and actually ends up establishing its own rule over large areas of India. So the startup capital, if you like, for the East India Company is partly generated by Elizabethan privateering. So that's what the English are doing as pirates and privateers. They also, of course, face pirates and privateers from other places. That early in the century, or in the later 15th century, there seemed to be particular problems with people from Brittany, partly because of the way the prevailing winds in the English Channel are. So if you set out from Brittany, you have southwestern winds to take you up into the Channel to attack English shipping in a way that the English shipping don't find it very easy to get away from you. So the English face up to pirates and privateers too.
And what was life of a Navy soldier like in the 1600s on board a ship, daily life, if you have a account of that?
I think, well, again, discipline is pretty harsh, as it has to be to keep a navy sailing effectively. We've got a lot of insight into the practicalities of life on board ships from all the finds on the Mary Rose. So we know what kind of plates people are eating off, what kind of cups they're drinking from. We know what kind of games they're playing. We know what equipment the surgeons, the medical staff on board the ship have to use. and so on. And we know again from the skeletons that many of the sailors have injuries to their knees and ankles, presumably from falling on ships or coming down out of the rigging or whatever. But there's still quite large areas of life on board ship, which again I think are probably quite hard to work out really exactly how things
now work. The movie is set a few hundred years later, so the technology and ship is a little bit different back then. But I want to ask, Master and Commander, would you say that kind of is accurate portrayal of what, even back in the 16th century, what life as a Navy soldier would be like?
So far as I know, I don't really. I haven't watched Master and Commander, and I don't know so much about the 18th and 19th century navies. I can remember, as I said, as a small boy, I used to read C.S. Forester's Hornblower novels. I can remember my mother being horrified when I was banging my bread on the plate, and she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm knocking the weevils out of my bread," because having just read that was what you did in the Navy in 1800, I thought I'd have a go. No, thankfully, no weevils came out of my bread when I did that.
So you have no evil in you then?
No, that's right. That's right.
I wanted to talk about the ranks a little bit and how you would rise. You mentioned that it wasn't a permanent position, but if you were a career soldier, how would you go on about rising in the army and get higher rank? Was there military academies for this? And again, I want to compare to the Roman army, where only the rich could be generals, and the richest held the highest position. Was this the case in the British Army in the 16th century as well, that on the rich could be the highest rank as a general or commander, or was there chance that a life soldier who was a career soldier could rise to eventually become a general?
The leading command positions are all given to people at the top end of the social hierarchy, and that's partly, of course, because they're political positions, so positions in advising the king and leading the country were generally given to those of high birth, and the command of an army, particularly a large army against France, is a major political prize. So great noblemen are very pleased to be asked by the king to go and lead an army, partly because if it works well, that's great for their reputation, and the king will be pleased with them and give them lots of reward, but also because of the way the army is organized. If you're put in command, you have lots of jobs to distribute to your friends and relations. So this is a major fund of reward that you can hand out to people that you want to encourage. And if it goes well, again, for example, you can knight your friends and relations who've been serving as captains under you, and that raises their social status. And if they've done well, the king might grant them another title or grant them some lands or whatever. So in some senses, war is a major political operation and a major political source of spoils, source of advancement. So from that point of view, military command goes with social rank. There are some historians who will argue, and I think it's probably true, that in some ways in 16th century circumstances that also makes sense, because aristocrats are the kind of people who are used to giving people orders and just expecting people to carry them out, and other people are used to aristocrats giving them orders. So just as in popular rebellions in the 16th century, often people, the popular rebels, they don't complain about the fact that great noblemen are running the country. They complain about the people who are not great noblemen who are running the country, because the assumption is if you've risen up by your talent, then you must be corrupt because you must be on the make. And probably you're not a very suitable person to be put in charge. Whereas if you're a great nobleman, you're so rich that you don't have to be corrupt. So possibly there's acceptance for the command by great aristocrats, even by people lower down in society and lower down in the army. On the other hand, there are clearly people who serve for a long period and gain experience and thereby gain influence and position within the army. Not high command, but somebody like Ellis Griffith, again, he's worked his way up, gaining more experience until the point where he's, again, the kind of position that you'd think of in a modern army as a sergeant major or that sort of situation. And similarly, particularly as the 16th century goes on, it's interesting that the title captain starts to be used more. So nobody would call you Captain Smith or Captain Brown or whatever in the 1520s or 30s, whereas by the 1570s and 80s, that title for someone whose main social distinction is that they're a military commander at sort of company level, that starts to be used. So that suggests that there is a sense that there are some people whose job is to be a lower ranking military commander, in the way that there are some people whose job is to be a lawyer, even though they're not one of the top judges in the top courts, or some people whose job is to be a financial official, even though they're not the Lord Treasurer in charge of the King's finances. So there is a measure of professionalization there. And by the late 16th and early 17th centuries, you start to get interesting clashes over the militia, which is the local defense force, where the local aristocrats think they should be in command of it, and in practice they are in command of it, because everybody locally knows who they are and everybody locally will do what they say. On the other hand, they don't actually necessarily have much military experience or know much about modern weapons and that kind of thing. So in the 1630s, King Charles I wants what he calls an exact militia. He wants to reform the militia and make it more efficient and modern. And he gets himself into difficulties, really, because he'll send experienced old soldiers, but who don't have much social respect locally, in to try to explain to these gentlemen how you're supposed to do things. And the gentlemen won't really take it very kindly, because they don't like being shown up in front of all their neighbours and the tenants who farm their lands and so on by some old chap with one leg who happens to have been in the wars in the Netherlands and actually does understand what you can and can't do with a musket in the way that some of these aristocrats don't. So there is tension that you can see there.
Yeah, and we talked about this in the Roman army episode, and Adrian Goldsworth said exactly the same, that when you come from a rich farming family in a rich Roman aristocratic family, they used to giving commands, and that's, he said exactly the same as you did, that they have experience giving command, and like a peasant, to put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So he said exactly the same thing that you did, that he would have experience, whereas a common soldier would not.
The other thing about noblemen is that they do realize, after all, being a noble politician is a very competitive business, as it is in Roman times. And therefore, if you want to get ahead, you have to make sure you're good at what you do, and you can take your opportunities. So you'll see noblemen, and the Earl of Essex in Elizabeth's reign would be a good example of this, who set themselves to study war and find out how to be a really successful commander, because they realize that doing it well and also having the respect of people who are military experts is going to be important to building a successful career. So I think we shouldn't think that aristocrats think, oh, well, I'll be fine because I'm an aristocrat and my ancestors were really good at this, so I'm sure I'll find it very easy. They study and work hard to think, how am I going to be an effective commander, even as the technology of war is changing and the circumstances of war are changing.
And I want to talk about when you first were right in the army, and then as a general, what was life like for when you came out of the battlefield? And I'm talking off the battle, not necessarily in battle, but in a military camp or on the march. What was it like for a military commander?
Well, I think it's quite comfortable in that you make sure that you've got some good food with you. You're riding quite a nice, comfortable horse, and you've probably got several spare horses if you need them. You've got servants with you who will try and make sure that you're all right, just as they would if you were at home. On the other hand, some of these aristocrats make great play of the fact that they've suffered alongside their soldiers. Numbers of them, somebody like the Duke of Somerset, the Earl of Hertford, who becomes Duke of Somerset, who's one of Henry VIII's leading commanders in his wars against Scotland, and then carries on commanding in the war against Scotland under Edward VI. He will take a spade and go and dig trenches along with the troops in order to show that he's as committed to the success of what they're doing as they are. And even though if he was riding around inspecting his fields, he wouldn't get off his horse and start digging with his peasants, because obviously that's not what you do if you're an aristocrat. When you're in the army and you're all trying to survive together, you all go and dig together. And you can
It reminds me of the joke from Monty Python. He must be a king. He hasn't got shit on himself.
Yeah, exactly. So, but if you're the Duke of Somerset, and you can see commanders in other European armies at the time, people like some of the noblemen in the Netherlands. I think William of Orange does this. They will go deliberately and dig with the soldiers to say, no, look, we're all in this together. And in the same way, there's a royal financial official who is touring around the army in Ireland in the I think it's in the 1530s or 40s, and obviously thinks that he ought to be able to live in a more comfortable style than most of the soldiers are doing. And one of the captains just tears a strip off him and saying, well, he's seen the Duke of Suffolk and the Duke of Norfolk and the greatest nobleman in England just living in hard circumstances like the soldiers when they're all on campaign together, and if they're prepared to do it, then this financial official should jolly well do the same. So there is a sort of we're all in this together, and it's hard being a soldier, but you've got to put up with it, and I'm putting up with it despite the fact that I'm a duke or an earl or whatever. There's a bit of that going on in the army.
Yeah, and again, I'm going to compare a lot to ancient Rome here, because that's kind of my strong suit, I would say. And Hadrian would as well go, Emperor Hadrian would work and live like a common soldier as he was a commoner.
Yep.
And at last, I want to talk about common. I don't know again what the common soldier. What was life for him? Was much like we talked a little bit about. Again, we talked about the discipline and the camp life, but can we talk a little bit more about this, perhaps?
Yes, in theory. Well, when the supply systems worked, the food was quite good, I think, by 16th century standards. So it's maybe forgetting the numbers, but it's something like a pound of beef a day and plenty of bread and up to 8 pints of beer. The beer is quite weak, I think. But it would certainly be plenty of food to keep yourself going on, even if you were doing quite a lot of physical activity. The problem, of course, is that the supply system doesn't always get the food through to them. But when it does, the food is quite good. The wages are not great. Sixpence a day, sixpence in old English pence, so that would be 2.5 English pence now. Obviously, that will buy a lot more in the 16th century than it would buy now. But it's so at the start of the 16th century, that would be quite a good wage by the standards of building workers or agricultural laborers or people like that, but the wage stays the same through the 16th century, or at least for much of it, which means that it's becoming less and less convincing as a wage to be paid. So those conditions are not bad, and in other ways, I think an awful lot just depends on where you are and what's happening. Bad weather can devastate armies, and even worse than that, disease can devastate armies. There's one campaign in particular in 1557 where we have records for how many of the English army are available for service at different points of the campaign, and they include not just people who are fit to fight, but also people who would be fit to fight if they weren't ill. And you can see, and there's some kind of bad epidemic, we're not exactly sure what, going through the army, and indeed going through the whole of Western Europe at that time. And very large numbers of people are just knocked out by it. In that case, we don't know how many recover, there's a bad outbreak of plague, probably bubonic plague, when the English army briefly occupies Le Havre in France in the early 1560s. And there we do know that very large numbers die of plague. And indeed, the army comes back to Portsmouth, the port on the south coast, to which they're returning. And then you can see the deaths and the burials in Portsmouth going right up because so many people have caught plague from the army. So disease is always going to kill more soldiers probably than enemy action is.
Would it be often that you would work without in the army without even seeing a fight, or was it rare that you would be in the army and not experience a battle at all?
Well, battles are quite rare. There are some very big battles, particularly between the English and the Scots. Flodden in 1513 is very big. Pinkie in 1547 is very big. There aren't such big battles between the English and the French as there had been in the 14th and 15th centuries. So if you're on campaign, you're likely to see some kind of combat, but it's much more likely to be fighting against small detachments of the other army, or fighting in a siege, quite a lot of sieges, or fighting against peasants who are trying to stop you taking their cattle or taking their crops or whatever it is you're trying to take from them in order to feed yourselves. So I think if you're on a campaign, you're quite likely to see fighting of some sort, but the variety will change, and you're not very likely to see a really big battle, which does mean that, as in the Middle Ages, really big battles are very memorable things, and people talk about Flodden for years and years afterwards. And indeed, you can see people in legal cases dating events by whether they were before or after the Battle of Flodden, because they just remember it as a really big event in their life and in the life of local society. And you can see why when you start to look at the size of the English army, because in 1513, because there's a big army in France besieging Terouanne and Tournai as well as this army fighting the Scots at Flodden, maybe 1 in 10 adult men is fighting in the army. So that's enough that most people probably knew somebody. That's quite a speculative argument, but probably if 1 in 10 adult men are fighting, most people in the country know somebody who's been in the army in 1513.
I asked this as well in the Roman army episode. Was there rare cases of PTSD in the British army as well, or was that not as common?
It's very hard to know. There are certainly people who come out with major wounds, which they talk about, physical wounds, and in some cases, people who are quite proud of their physical wounds because they're taken to show that they've fought in a very courageous way. Psychological damage is just much harder to detect, really, and it's not clear whether people aren't talking about it, or whether they aren't experiencing it in quite the same way. And of course, there are influential arguments that warfare in the 16th century, as in the Middle Ages, is just less different from everyday life than it's become in the 19th and 20th, in particular 20th centuries, because although battles are very loud, they're nothing like as loud as they become in the 20th century. Although people see death a lot on the battlefield, they see death a lot in major plague outbreaks that can take out a third or a quarter of the population of a town. People see a lot of blood in battles, but they see a lot of blood in agricultural accidents, in killing animals all the time, and so on. So we mustn't get too carried away with those arguments and say, oh well, people barely noticed war because it was just like a rough Saturday night. I think that's nonsense. But to say that some of the things that people find very new recruits in particular find very shocking about 20th century war are not as shocking probably in the 16th century. And there's an interesting argument to this effect in Yuval Harari's work, who before he wrote his big general books like Sapiens, he worked on military memoirs in the 16th century, and he points out that 16th century military memoirists don't say a lot of the things that we all expect to read in 20th and 21st century military memoirs about how war was a shock because it was nothing like they expected it to be, because it was nothing like in the movies, and so on. 16th century people seem to be much more matter of fact about war. Now, is that just because it's their culture to be matter of fact about things, or is it because in some ways war is less alien to them than it is to people taken into the army in the 20th century?
My brother worked for the army, and he was sent to Lithuania. And in there, we figure the only PTSD he will have there is the food.
Aha, yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much for coming. I think we covered the basic of British military in the 16th century. It was super interesting, and I appreciate you taking the time for coming on. And before you go, do you have any social media or anything you wish to promote that you want me to put in the description?
Nothing special. My book on the English people at war in the age of Henry VIII is now in paperback, so if people want to read that, that's there. And our current research project is this work on accidental death and everyday life in the 16th century. So if people just search for Oxford Tudor accidents, they'll find us there. And there's some stuff about firearms and other weapons on there, as well as all kinds of other aspects of 16th century life that we can look at through the lens of accidental death.
What do you think of Blackadder when we first started?
Sorry?
How accurate is Blackadder?
Oh, well, it's the jokes work because they capture some bits of 16th century life very well. But historians always say things like this, don't they? Then there are bits where you think, oh no, that's not right at all. So, for example, the Puritan, are they uncle and aunt, I think, that Blackadder has. In some ways, they're very funny, but actually, I think they're covered with crosses, which most Puritans would find absolutely horrendous, because they think the sign of the cross is potentially superstitious. So there are bits where you think, oh no, I'm not sure that's right, and then other bits which you think, yep, that's wonderful. It's probably a problem, isn't it, with knowing too much about something, because I find the 18th century version of Blackadder uproariously funny, partly because I don't know quite so much about the 18th century. So a little knowledge
kind of ruins it, doesn't it? When you study the era, that's kind of ruined the show.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. And my name is Erlend. We are available on social media under well.h2well on Instagram, and our podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find us. And please like, share, and subscribe. We just something for everyone on this podcast. If you like history from the Ottoman Empire to pirates to recent history, and you should definitely find something that you like if you are a fan of history. Next week, we are joined by Al Muqaddimah to talk about the rise of Islam, which will be fascinating. And my name's Alan. This has been Well That Aged Well, and I'll see you next time.